Hello and welcome back to A Clear and Obvious podcast. As always, I'm your host Archie Corbett and I'm joined by the delightful Sam Cole.
Hi Archie, it's a pleasure to be here.
It is indeed, because we are joined by commentary legend Ian Darke. Ian, first of all, how are you?
Fine. I'm not sure I can live up to that billing of legend.
I figured I'd set you up on a pedestal before we get straight into it. We'd love to start off where you sort of began in your career, and obviously it's a football podcast, but we can't ignore the fact that you started off in boxing. You just tell us how you first got into boxing commentary and first got into that side of things.
Well, quite by accident, actually, because I used to work at BBC Radio Sports Department in London, and Desmond Lynam was the boxing commentator. And you'll know that Des made it pretty big in television. He was just leaving for television. He couldn't cover this Muhammad Ali fight against Larry Holmes. And so I was just a junior around the office doing the 3rd and 4th division roundup, as it was then, and any office jobs. But I was the only person there who had really the slightest inkling or covered the boxing on any kind of regular basis. So they said, go to Las Vegas and cover that Muhammad Ali fight for us. So that's where I started, covering Muhammad Ali against Larry Holmes. I'd never been to America. I'd never been to Las Vegas. And I was thinking, do you know what? The first thing I've got to do here is try and get an interview with Muhammad Ali. So I found out where he was training, and I went down there and sidled up very naively to his trainer, Angelo Dundee, and they were working. I shouldn't really have interrupted. He was doing a bit of training. And I said, Mr. Dundee, I'm from the BBC in England. Do you think I maybe could get an interview sometime this week with Muhammad? And he shouted out in front of everyone, it was a big crowd watching, hey, Muhammad, we got a guy here. We got a guy from England, wants to talk to you. And then Ali went into this big spiel in front of everyone saying, I love England. England's the only place they know about boxing. Let's talk to the guy from England. Let's invite the guy from England up. So I get in the ring and he's skipping rope and I'm interviewing Muhammad Ali, and I hadn't even thought what the questions would be. I was a nervous wreck, but of course it was Muhammad Ali. So I never, ever had to think through the interview. Basically, he took over and did a 5-minute show on my microphone. So basically everything from that point in my career has been downhill.
That is the ultimate example of starting right at the top. I mean, he's a sporting god, as we all know. So you obviously went in there without sort of any proper questions lined up. I mean, just how intimidating was that for you, as you say, sort of being at the sports desk with the BBC to being out in Las Vegas, say, a few days later? I mean, just describe that for us.
Frankly, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what happened at a big fight. I had to ask the journalists from the national newspapers, and they thought I was really wet behind the ears. But they couldn't believe that within a couple of hours of arriving in Las Vegas, I'd actually got an interview with Muhammad Ali. So I made some instant friends because I played them the tape and they could all get quotes from Ali to send back to their newspapers. So I was kind of in straight away there. But I was just a wide-eyed kid, to be honest with you, around that fight. I didn't really know boxing enough. But hey, I did the job and people seemed to think it was a pretty good job. And to be honest, it was the saddest fight I ever saw because it was the fight before your time. He got badly beaten up in that fight. And he did have one fight afterwards, but effectively that was the end. That was the end of Muhammad Ali.
It is a real shame on that front. But I mean, your commentary career from there in terms of boxing, I mean, you clearly made a great impression because there's one fight that really sticks out that you commentated on, the Amanda Holyfield's Mike Tyson second fight, where Tyson famously bit Holyfield's ear off. How do you go about describing someone biting someone's ear? I mean, just take us through that.
Well, Archie, it was incredible because you're watching something like that and in your head, you see that happen and you think, did that really happen? Am I really going to accuse Mike Tyson of biting off Evander Holyfield's ear? But I kind of did a double check and thought, yeah, that is what happened. But straight away, when you're a commentator, something kicks in editorially and you're thinking, this is going to be massive all over the world. This is a mega story. Of course, it was the fight they called in the end the bite of the century.
I mean, that's like the last thing, obviously, you expect from a fight. Is there a point where you're sat there and you watch that happen? Are you kind of looking around to almost your fellow commentators sort of sat around the ring, being like, did that really just happen? Or are you sort of just, as you say, going off your own instinct?
I think you just go off your own instinct. Everybody else is doing their own broadcast. So on you go and react accordingly. And you just hope that you captured the moment as a commentator. And that's true. Doesn't matter what it is, a big match or a big fight or any other big sporting event. You just hope that you somehow manage to capture the moment and convey it, and that what you said kind of rings through the ages a little bit, but often you fail. If I'm honest, it doesn't always work that way.
Yeah. In 2010, you started working for ESPN, covering football for an American market. Did your commentary change when calling for an American audience instead of a British one?
Sam, no, that's not true at all. I just carried commentating the same way. There are slight differences, though, in America. I mean, when I first went there, it was to cover the World Cup in 1994, when the USA staged the World Cup. And then knowledge of the game there was, well, pitiful, really, because producers were saying things like to me, you better explain what a throw-in is. What's a throw-in? So I'd say 20 minutes gone here, still 0-0. They go, don't you mean 0-0? Say 0-0. What is offside? People won't understand offside. You better explain it. So that's what it was like in 1994. Now, if you go to the USA, you'll find millions of people love the game and they've got great knowledge of the game. So it would be an insult, really, to try and pitch it in any way differently than you would doing it in Europe or Great Britain.
Yeah. At ESPN, you do punditry as well as your commentary. How do you feel like you've adjusted to that role?
Well, I appear on a program called ESPN FC that they do nightly, which goes out around the world. It's on peak time, I understand, in some places in the West Indies and Australia and South Africa. So I've always done that kind of thing. So I think any commentator is quite happy, usually, appearing sort of as a pundit as well, and maybe expressing a few opinions. But of course, it's a completely different job to being a commentator, because 95% of the job commentating on a football match is identifying the players. As boring as that might sound, it is. The rest of it really is so much frills. But when you're on as a pundit, I think that there's a duty to be kind of colourful and a little bit pungent if you can, and say something interesting.
Yeah. When starting your American journey, did you ever think you would be commentating on a romantic date or having your name chanted at a football game?
I never heard my name being chanted at a football game. That is quite humbling. I don't think it had happened in the UK for certain, because most commentators are vilified amid a sort of tribal torrent of abuse after every game and being accused of bias. But yeah, I was lucky enough in a way. I commentated in the USA on a very big goal for the US team. When they played against Algeria. They were going out the World Cup, 93rd minute, last kick of the game, Landon Donovan scores. And I kind of went off on one. It's like 10 on the Richter scale. And I said, go USA somewhere in the middle of it, which sounds kind of ridiculous now. But I always think commentaries are of the moment they happened in. And that really was an incredible moment in the whole history of US soccer. So it was right in the seconds that I said it in, I think, and it kind of caught on, and I got a big response to it. And yeah, I'm glad it's nice, and it led to me signing for ESPN on a permanent basis and doing US matches, which I still do to this day.
So speaking of World Cups, there, obviously you've been lucky enough to comment on several World Cups. Players sort of describe it like obviously convenience of a time, like a bubble. But what's it actually like being in sort of that World Cup camp, almost sort of separate from the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's a sort of a rarefied atmosphere. And although we all get paid for covering the World Cup, I can bet you that every single commentator there would really do it for nothing. Because if you do the job that we do, you want to be at the big show, and the biggest show is the World Cup. Now, I love it. I'm absolutely in love with the World Cup, and I always want to be there no matter what. And I've been lucky enough to go to, I think it's 7. First one I went to was Spain in 1982. Commentated on a couple of finals, but yeah, it's you're kind of caught up in this whirlpool of, love for the game, really. The best one, I think, was Italia 90. I don't think the football was the best in Italia 90. There were a lot of dull games there. But the way that Italy was absolutely submerged in football for those 6 weeks was incredible. And I remember the tears of all the Italian fans sitting in the gutter outside the stadium in Naples when they got knocked out on penalties by Argentina in the semi-finals. I mean, it was the end of the dream for them. I thought there'd be huge fights outside. Italy against Argentina, the host nation have gone out. It's all going to kick off. No, they were all just crying their eyes out, sitting in the gutter.
You speak about Italia 90 there, and obviously it was before mine and Sam's time, but we've watched loads about it since. And of what we understand, it was a tournament that's changed English football as well. I mean, it was at a point where England's national team wasn't in the best of states. And Italia 90 sort of unified the nation. Did you get a sense of that when you were out there commentating from the England point of view?
I didn't cover too many of the England games. The one England game I got to cover there, and I was working for the Australian broadcasting company there called SBS with Martin Tyler and a couple of others. So I got England-Cameroon in Italian 90. And that was a great game as well, which England probably shouldn't have won. But yeah, because you're mixing with all the English fans, they get talking to you, the journalists are talking to you, and there was rising excitement. England weren't that great in the group, but they got better and better as the tournament went on. There was David Platt scored a goal to win it against Belgium, kind of against the odds, that sort of hooked volley that you guys might have seen just on YouTube from way back. Yeah, it was good. And really, to be honest with you, it was a bit of a story of what might have been that, because England probably should have won the World Cup in the end, because I think had they beaten Germany in the semi-final, and I think they deserved to that night, but went out on penalties, I think they would have won the final, because Argentina arrived at the final through a series of penalty shootouts, playing some pretty dirty football, to be honest with you, cynical stuff. And I think they had 4 people suspended for the final. I think England would have beaten them, but there you go. It was good. It was very good.
Certainly. And when you look back on tournaments like that, specifically sort of Italia 90, but sort of in a broader sense, the other tournaments that you've done, is there one that you can pick out that you sort of went to and you look back on really fondly and think, yeah, that was the tournament that I enjoyed the most or had the biggest impact on me, for instance?
I think Italia 90 was the one, because we used to sit out in the street after covering the games. I can remember sitting out in Rome, the street cafes, having a few beers. David Pleat and Jerry Francis and people like that, they were working with us there, and they'd sit with us and they'd tell us all kinds of stories. And if Italy had played that night and they'd won, all these fans were driving around in open top vehicles, waving flags and hooting horns. It was incredible. I remember one night we ended up at about 4:00 in the morning back in the hotel, or outside the hotel, playing cricket in the street. And the hotel manager went out to tell us off, and then he thought, "Well, this is interesting. Can I play?" So we were playing cricket with the hotel manager. I mean, another time I remember I was working with John Harkes, ex-USA footballer, and one night we came back again. We'd probably had 1 or 2 beers too many. We ended up playing football in reception at the hotel. We got a football out, and we're hitting volleys across the reception, but everybody loved it, because it was like, oh, well, it's a World Cup, this is what's going on. So it's funny how you remember a lot of your trips for social reasons more than the actual games, if the truth be told. I mean, I loved going to Russia. A lot of people had reservations about going to Russia, but everybody should go to St. Petersburg. What a fantastic city that is. It's just stayed light all night in June, and everywhere you looked, spectacular sights. So I very much enjoyed the Russian trip as well, really.
I can imagine. I mean, it just sounds like, as well as work, you just had a laugh abroad. It sounds amazing. And
you've got to, actually, Archie, you've got to stay sane, because it's quite intense. Prepping the games, getting on aeroplanes, traveling. So it usually goes game, travel, match, travel, and that's what it's like. So any little windows you can get to relax in, take them.
As you say, it sounds incredible. And you say sort of that you've worked with many sort of ex international players, also specifically ex-England players. And when we went in the run-up to major tournaments, World Cups, Euros, that sort of thing, there's this pressure and almost this hysteria around the England team. Have any of them sort of spoke to you about that and the kind of the pressures that builds upon a person?
Yeah, I remember talking to Owen Hargreaves once, and I'm sure he won't mind me repeating the story. And he said it was really difficult being in the England camp. And if you want a clue about why the golden generation didn't really work as they should have done, it was because there was a lot of inter-club rivalries there at the time. The Manchester United lot wouldn't talk to the Arsenal lot, it wouldn't talk to the Chelsea lot, and little cliques formed. So maybe that's why they didn't produce as much as they should have done with the kind of players who were around. But Owen told me, he said, sometimes he was amazed. He'd sit on the team bus after the game, and the players would be sitting there going, oh, I'm going to get 5 out of 10 for that tomorrow in the sun. And I said, what, the players are worried about what mark the sun gives them? I said, let me tell you something, Owen. I said, the guys who are writing the newspaper reports, they're only half watching the game. They're trying to get their piece over. And so when they do the marks at the end of it, they go, oh, how did he play? Okay, 6. Yep, 6. I said, most of them get 6. I said, if somebody was brilliant or got a hat trick, they'll go to 9 and so on. So, yeah. I mean, and I think there was a fear factor. I think there's been a fear factor for a long time. And I think Gareth Southgate's removed it. And that's one of the biggest things he's done. Most of the players kind of didn't want to be part of it. There was too much pressure to do well. And the tabloids were very, very harsh for a long time with England managers. You don't see it quite so much now, but there used to be headlines like when Bobby Robson was in charge of, like, for God's sake, go, Bobby. What a load of rubbish, all that kind of thing. So I think they've removed that now. And I think they've removed the feeling that playing for England is a bit of a chore that maybe some of the former players had. Now, I think the players, a lot of them, if you look at their background, they came through lower league, non-league football, having been there on loan, like Harry Kane. He played for a lot of clubs before he became a star. It took him many years to be an overnight sensation. You can go through the team, Harry Maguire and so on. They love wearing that white shirt. It's a pinnacle of the career. And I think you saw that at the 2018 World Cup, the togetherness, the spirit, which is that sort of indefinable something, I think, that can lift a half-decent team into one that, are real contenders.
So you still speak about there, sort of Hargreaves kind of speaking after his career about how that had massive pressure on him. But obviously you were at World Cups, as you've said. Do you get a sense as a commentator, do you realise the impact that, say, tabloid headlines and scathing articles are having on players at the time? Or is that only something you sort of realise when speaking to them post-career?
No, I think you realise, because in a way, although we're commentators, we're kind of like journalists too. You have to know, to be a commentator, you have to know what the story is. So, for instance, I was commentating on England-Iceland in 2016 in Nice. It was a dreadful performance. And for half the game, Steve McManaman was working with me. We were doing it for ESPN in America. For half the game, I don't kid you here, he had his head in his hands. I had to keep on nudging him and go, come in here, Steve, because we knew that the team were going to be absolutely slaughtered the next day. I mean, they were dreadful, and we were saying as much as well. So, yeah, you always have to kind of take the temperature of a game. And I think that's part of being a commentator, to know what's at stake and to know what the storylines are going to be.
So in your career, you've commentated on so many big games and tournaments, from Premier League to Champions League to World Cups. Do you get to a point now where you've commentated on so many massive events that they no longer faze you?
That's a good question, Sam. Faze, probably not the right word, but I think you should feel a little bit of fear. You should have, not fear, that's not right either, but maybe a little bit of adrenaline. If you don't have adrenaline anymore, it's quite hard to perform. You don't want to be too relaxed about it. But when you've done it for as long as I have, I'm at the veteran stage now. When you've done it that long, you're not going to be worried about it. But what you will worry about, I think, is making sure that you've got all your preparation right for the game. That you've researched it, you know everything you should know about the players. You can make sure that you recognize all the players, and the warm-up before the game is quite handy in that these days. You can look through binoculars and go, okay, well, those two look a little bit similar, but he's wearing blue boots and he's wearing orange. Okay, I've got that in my head. Little things like that. And then, this sounds really prosaic, but it's true, and it's not part of the glamour of it. Things like making sure that the sound is right in your headphones, the mix of the sound between the sound effects, the other commentator, the producer who's talking to you all the time. If that's wrong, it's really hard to do it. So you have to concentrate on all those little things, as well as then switching into game mode when the match starts.
You speak about that kind of the pressure of a big game, and this is slightly off topic, but sort of relevant as well. When you're kind of going to a game, do you have? I mean, players do, but do you have sort of a pre-match routine that you do? Do you, for instance, try and get there an extra hour before everyone else to get to speak to people? Is there sort of a routine that you have?
Yeah, I arrive ridiculously early, and I think most commentators do, because I have a nightmare. I have this nightmare, and I have it quite often at home, where I am rushing up the stairs to the commentary position, and I can't find where the commentary position is, and I can hear all the roars going on that the game's obviously started, and I'm not at the microphone. So yeah, there are a lot of concerns like that. So I always get there early. I like to have a lot of time, and we can't do it at the moment because we're separated from the areas the players go to. But sometimes in the old times, you could go down the tunnel. You might even be invited in by some managers to have a cup of tea with them before the game, and they'll let you know what their team's going to be. And they'll say, keep it to yourself, but it'll be da 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 da. This is that's the lineup. But don't put that on TV until the last 5 minutes before the game. So thanks very much. I'll put it in my back pocket. Things like that, or you might just check with the player how to pronounce his name. You can't do that at the moment because of COVID. But if you get there in time, you've got a lot of time to do that, to talk to the producer, to just maybe swap a couple of stories with other commentators. They might tell you something they'd heard, or you might tell them something and just share it. We're usually pretty friendly like that, but it's not that cutthroat. But so, I very, very similar build up every time. Arrive, 3 hours to go, maybe go to the media room, have a cup of tea and a sausage sandwich or something, go through my notes, talk to the other people, maybe go down to the tunnel area and pick up any little tidbits of information. And then with 75 minutes to go, get the teams. Okay, then highlight all the players who are playing on my sheet, go up to my position, make sure all the sound is right, and then you're into the game. So it's quite a long day. It might be sort of like it might be a 7:45 kickoff, but really the day starts very, very early with you setting off and in good time to make sure you're there.
I kind of want to dig a little bit deeper on one thing that you brought up there. And feel free if you can't speak about it, but you spoke about managers that would sort of give you some extra information before games to go and have a coffee with them. Which managers were good for that and which weren't? Obviously, if you can't answer this, feel free and we'll move on. But I'm quite intrigued by that.
No, I can definitely answer it. You tend to find that it's the British managers, Steve Bruce, Sam Allardyce, Roy Hodgson, even Sir Alex Ferguson when he was managing would be quite helpful to you. They kind of got a respect for what you do, and after a while they've heard your voice and they've heard you doing commentaries, and I think a kind of a trust builds up, or you hope that it does. And if you catch them in the right mood, they'll help you out and say, well, look, so if I was covering Newcastle, and I am this week, I'll be able to ring Steve Bruce because I've dealt with him a few times. He's been a manager a long time, and I could say, can you give us a steer on what the team's going to be? And I'm pretty sure he'd say, well, he's injured, and like Hayden's not going to play this time, and I'm going to I'm going to probably bring so and so in on the right, and he'll give me some info, and you just get a little bit of a feel about where the club is from having that kind of conversation. And I think it's part of building up a little bit of empathy as well. It's nice to talk to somebody from both of the clubs just to get where that club is at the moment. Not always easy, and I think the trickiest one of all is when you're covering a team like in the FA Cup, who are hardly ever on TV. You've got to go and see them either in training or find some game where they're playing on a Tuesday night at Mansfield or something to have a look at them, to have a chance of being able to commentate on the game. By the time the game starts, you've got to sound like you know as much about that team as the people who watch them every week. That isn't easy.
I personally find that extraordinary that you can just sort of ring up Steve Bruce now and sort of, say, what's the team news going to be? Because that, to me, seems like something that would have been done more kind of, say, 20, 30 years ago. Is that the case? Or is that done a little bit less, sort of speaking to managers and finding out stuff? Or is that something that's carried on? Yeah,
you're spot on. It was done a lot more in days gone by, because now there are so many more TV commentators and radio commentators covering every game. Going back, as you said, 30 years ago, you were probably the only television commentator covering the game. Now there are all kinds of websites and club channels, and the managers think, okay, it's on TV, every game's on TV, big deal. Why do I have to help? If I give him the team, is it going to be on Twitter? So if I went up to Jose Mourinho and asked the same question, or tried to call him up, I haven't got his phone number, but say I did, he would just think I'd arrived from Mars. There's absolutely no chance that he'd tell you any kind of information ahead of the game, because I think where they came through, being managers on the continent, nobody ever did that. It's not part of the commentary culture to ever ask that. So they look like you've from some other planet. And I know Pep, you notice when Pep Guardiola came to Britain and he had to do pre-match interviews, and you could see he was thinking, what is this? Why do I have to do this talk before the game? I'm not telling anybody anything about what I'm doing before the game. So he gave a lot of interviewers a pretty hard time in those interviews before the match. A lot of the answers were extremely short.
I can imagine. Moving on, just on a more personal note, one of them, probably the most memorable game in my mind that you've done that really sticks out for me is the Barcelona comeback against PSG in 2017. I mean, it was an unbelievable game. What were your thoughts at that time? What were your thoughts on that game at that time, and how did you kind of commentate on such? How were you able to sort of build up the adrenaline and sort of the pressure of the game? Did that sort of go hand in hand with the action on the pitch?
Yeah. I think you've got it in one there. That's what happens. I think it was looking a dead game, really, with 7 minutes to go. Paris Saint-Germain were going through. No question about it. Barcelona needed 3 goals. Well, I think Neymar hit a free kick in, didn't he? 7 minutes to go. And you're thinking, well, just keeps the door open ajar a little bit. And sometimes your experience tells you to just keep that bridge to a possible drama that might develop going. And that's quite a good way of making sure the audience come with you, I think, on that journey. And on that day, the incredible happened, didn't it? The fantasy finish. I remember thinking after the game, thank goodness I called that winning goal correctly, because the goal scorer is a little bit of an unusual one. It was Roberto, wasn't it, who scored the winner. And I think, how did I pick him up in that crowded penalty area? But thank goodness I did, because you have a nightmare that there's a big pivotal goal there's going to be 1,000 replays of it. You haven't got the goal scorer right, so and they've got to kind of dub over it or something. But no, if every commentator, if I'm being blunt, the first feeling you have after a goal is, I did call that the right goal scorer, didn't I?
Yeah, I mean, just one of the examples there. You've commentated at the Nou Camp. You've commentated on like so many stadiums in your career. But what is the stadium you've enjoyed commentating at the most? And then on the flip side, what is the ground you've enjoyed commentating the least?
Okay. Thank you for giving me advance notice of that question, by the way. I'd put number one Borussia Dortmund's stadium. 80,000 people in there, the yellow wall and all that. It is an incredible atmosphere. And I was lucky to be there when they played Paris Saint-Germain earlier this season. Just a great night. And it just feels like a real football town, Dortmund. So yeah, I love going there. So I'd put that number one. Where do I not like going? Well, I think all of us would say places where the team you're covering are maybe wearing stripes and you can't see the numbers. That's difficult. And I'm not going to name the guilty parties here. There are one or two teams playing in the Premier League who are guilty of that. And I always have a bit of a bee in my bonnet that the Premier League should turn around to them and say, look, your numbers aren't good enough, that we're broadcasting this around the world. Make sure they're better. But only commentators care about stuff like that. But the worst definitely for me was Port Vale. Many years ago, I had to cover Port Vale against Stoke, local derby in the FA Cup. And we had to do the commentary. It was me and Andy Gray on the roof of the stadium in the outdoors. And it wasn't just pouring with rain. It was torrential. It was like being on the deck of a trawler in the Atlantic in a storm. We're almost being blown off the roof, as well as getting soaked to the skin. All the equipment got wet. I think we had to change the microphones 6 times. We had engineers working at our feet. All the players' shirts were just covered, were brown. It was a nightmare. And afterwards, I was so wet. I thought, I'm going to get flu here. I had to drive sort of 200 miles home after the game, and I was soaked. So I basically stripped off to my underpants. So that's the only safe way that I'm going to stay healthy. But if I'd been stopped by the police that night, I might not have gone much further in my career.
It'd certainly be quite. It'd be quite the scandal that.
By the way, lovely club. Nice people.
Well saved. Well, as we know you're a busy man, so we'll leave it on this question. It's a question about sort of the art of commentary and how the main commentator and the co-commentator, and how important is that dynamic and getting that on-air chemistry. And have you found, you spoke about Steve McManaman with that Iceland game. Are there particular sort of co-commentators that you found a real sort of fondness with, or a real kind of good chemistry with, or is it sort of the same across the board?
I like working with just about all of them. All of them have become like broadcasting professionals. Some have done it for longer than others. Some, when they're new to it, you might just have to coach a little bit about, here's what's expected, because maybe they haven't been given enough of an introduction to the business in the first place. But people get better. The chemistry kind of happens or it doesn't happen, I think. But I think as a ground rule, what you want to get is a bit of a warmth, a little bit of a rapport, and I think it's important to have a change of gear as well in the match. If you're a guest in somebody's living room, if somebody's sitting at home, it's quite nice if you could just raise a smile from time to time. And also, I always say to co-commentators, especially if they're sort of quite new to it, is don't think when I stop talking, you have to start. It isn't radio. Just let it breathe for a little bit. We don't want to be bores in the corner of people's living rooms, just chattering on and on and on and on and giving them any number of stats that they didn't really want to know. So I always think that the stats are a bit like a bit of salt and pepper that you might put on a meal. You just sprinkle it on. But we've all been guilty of using too many stats over the years. But the commentary isn't really about stats. It's about picking up the personalities and the stories and the subplots of the game. And yeah, you hope you will bounce off the guy you're working with. But the other thing I always say to the guys who are your co-commentators is, they've usually played at the very top level of the game. Steve McManaman and Glenn Hoddle and Owen Hargreaves, who I mentioned earlier on, and many more that I work with. You've played at that level, so tell me things that the guys sitting at home and the audience sitting at home can't see for themselves. They can see you just went past the post. Give us an insight that maybe only a professional footballer who'd played at that kind of level would know. Because I can watch 1,000 games, and I like to think I do know the game, but I don't know it like somebody who played it at that level. So if you can tell them something they can't see, that's important too as well. And I think a lot of them who do the job are able to do that as well.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. I hope you've enjoyed it, because we certainly have.
Yeah, I'm very pleased. My pleasure, Archie and Sam. Thank you very much.